Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In the previous video, we saw the breakup of John and Cynthia's marriage. Cynthia saw it coming once John got into drugs. She couldn't stop him, and he told her all about his affairs, probably in the hopes that she would leave him. She wanted to stay with him, but John was ready to move on. So let's see what happens next according to Peter Brown in his book, The Love You Make. Peter set up the terms of John and Cynthia's divorce, and he was asked to arrange the terms of Yoko's divorce from Tony Cox. Charles Levinson, a London lawyer, handled the divorce, but most of the negotiations were done at Peter Brown's office at Apple. There he met with John, Yoko, Cox, and the lawyers. John agreed to pay all the joint debts of Yoko and Cox, which came to $100,000. This included back rent, bills from various film labs, and the repayment of various loans. No wonder Yoko was so eager to get together with John. And then John also agreed to pay for the cost of the divorce, which included moving Cox to the Virgin Islands, where he could live. For the first few months, John and Yoko lived out of suitcases. Yoko said, "We were shoved around a bit. We were basically two illicit lovers without any place to go." They spent a few nights at Paul's house on Cavendish Avenue, but it was too much Paul for them, so they went to stay with Neil Aspinall for a week. They ended up in Ringo's old flat in the basement apartment on Montague Square. While they were there, they used the excuse as feeling like outlaws to begin to take heroin. Yoko said they took it as a celebration of ourselves as artists, as she put it, and Yoko said that George Harrison blamed her for getting John on heroin. She said it wasn't true. John wouldn't take anything he didn't want to take. Those close to John felt that Yoko got John on heroin to control him. Peter said the single element that was the most crucial in the breakup of the Beatles was John's heroin addiction. Paul's relationship with Jane Asher was coming to an end after 5 years, at the same time as John and Yoko's relationship was beginning. So Jane was working and touring Great Britain with the Bristol Old Vic, and Paul wasn't happy without a woman, and it was at this time he started to see Linda Eastman. She had gone to an Apple press conference and given him her phone number. Paul arranged to meet up with her at the Nat Weiss's East Side apartment, and they spent the next few days together. Paul said he was fond of children, so Linda then introduced her daughter Heather, who was 6 at the time, and Paul would babysit while Linda went to photograph a rock concert at the Fillmore. Paul McCartney later went to a record convention for Capitol Records in Los Angeles. While he was there, he wanted to play. In a bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel, he was entertaining. In one bedroom, Paul had a beautiful young starlet. In the other room, he had one of LA's most famous black call girls named Cass. And she was sharing the 3-bedroom bungalow with Paul, and she got to see his juggling act. He went from one bedroom to another, stopping only to sign room service bills. Sunday morning, Linda called, and she had flown to California at her own expense and was in the hotel lobby. So Paul told her to come to the bungalow. So then he took her to the sitting room, and after that he knocked on each of the girls' bedroom and told them to dress and go. And he and Linda talked while the other two left. During this time, Peggy Lipton appeared unannounced on his doorstep of the bungalow to say she loved him, and he said he was busy and shut the door in her face. So Linda spent the night, and the next day Paul took her sailing on a yacht of John Calley, then head of production at Warner Brothers. Linda also went back to New York with Paul and Ron Cass, and she had a bag that was filled with marijuana. Marijuana was her favorite vice. Paul shook his head no. Cass turned to Linda and asked if she had anything, and she was nonchalant and said she had a couple of kilos and a Gucci bag sitting at her feet. Cass went to the supervisor and said that searching Paul and his friend in public would cause embarrassment. They didn't think that Paul had a bomb, did they? So the officials were adamant that everyone had to be searched, and when Cass went back to the Ambassador Lounge, he kicked the Gucci bag underneath a long row of plastic turquoise chairs and left it there. It was unnoticed in the search, and when they had been searched, Linda got the bag back and carried it on the plane. Cass was angry at Linda, and he couldn't wait to get rid of her in New York. Paul still cared for Jane and wished he would come home from the tour. But in the meantime, he found someone to keep him company. Her name was Francy Schwartz. She was from New Jersey, and she showed up at the Apple office. She had a letter and a script for Paul to read. The secretary usually sent these girls away, but for some reason, she told Francy to come back in the afternoon when Paul was there. Francy had been a ragamuffin earlier, but when she returned, she bought a dress and got her hair done. Paul took her to his office after they were introduced. They went out for cocktails and dinner, and then she spent the night at St. John's Wood. Within a week, Paul requested that Francy be given a job at Apple, and she was placed at a corner desk in the publicity department. 3 weeks with Francy there wasn't much that she was doing but just being Paul's girlfriend. Then she started staying at Cavendish Avenue, and one night Jane came home unexpectedly. The groupies that stood in front of his house tried to warn him over the house intercom, but Paul thought they were playing a joke on him. And just like Cynthia, Jane walked in and discovered a woman wearing her bathrobe. Jane stormed out of the house and drove off. Later, Mrs. Asher went to the house to pick up Jane's clothing, dishes, pots, and pans. They were seen a few times after that, and a month later, Jane mentioned on the BBC Simon D show that her and Paul's engagement had been broken by Paul. Jane rarely saw or spoke to him again. Years later, she resented her public association with him and didn't want to discuss Paul in her interviews. And today she is a highly regarded actress in England, and she married political cartoonist Gerald Scarfe, and they had a son and daughter and live in London. Francy was sent on her way, and she wrote a book when she got back to America. It was about her short affair with Paul, and it was titled Body Count. Linda, in the meantime, hadn't given up on Paul and kept calling and writing. In early autumn, Paul invited Linda to London to see the house at Cavendish Avenue, and she never left. Business-wise, Peter said that the Apple boutique had turned into a money pit. After being open for 7 months, it had lost £200,000, and it was because of poor planning and incompetence. The Fool was gone, and it wasn't on the best of terms. In the previous January, John Linden, who replaced Pete Shotton as manager of the boutique, sent angry letters to the Fool and their management, and he threatened to bar them from the shop if they removed any more garments from the store or charged any former debts to Apple. The customers only seemed to be there to shoplift or stare at Jenny Boyd, who was working there as a salesperson. The final blow came when a newspaper columnist criticized the Beatles for having turned into shopkeepers. This made John and Paul so mad they decided to close the shop right away. They decided instead of liquidating the merchandise, they would give it away. July 31st, the entire contents of the store and stockrooms were to be open to the public, and they could take whatever they wanted. Monday night, before the giveaway, Yoko and John arrived at the shop, and the employees watched as Yoko spread large swatches of fabric out on the floor and started to pile merchandise onto it. She knotted the corners of the fabric, hobo style, and dragged them out of the store on her back and into the Rolls Royce. The morning of the giveaway, there'd been plenty of publicity beforehand, so the line was 3 blocks long. The basement door was open so that the people could walk in front way, wander around, and exit from the other end. The Beatles said that there was no limit on what one person could take. Rack after rack of Hobbit clothing was brought down, and the public was grabbing it. People got back in line 2 and 3 times. When all the merchandise was gone, bolts of raw silk and velvets were torn apart by the crowds. They even took hangers and store fixtures. No one stopped them until a woman tried to pry the carpeting off the floor. Wow, what a greedy crowd. So almost a month later, a new Apple corporation moved into new headquarters. It cost £500,000. It was a beautiful 5-story Georgian house at 3 Seville Road. Each executive was given his own spacious office and allowed to decorate it. On the second floor, up a flight of apple green carpeted steps, was a large office for the Beatles and Neil overlooking Seville Road. The office was never really fully decorated by the Beatles because they kept changing their minds on what it should look like. The third floor was where the press office was, and Derek Taylor was in charge of it. Peter Brown's office was across from the Beatles on the second floor rear. On the higher floors were the A&R offices, a film department, accounting offices, music publishing, a film library, and an office for office management headed by Alistair Taylor. And Alex got to work with a construction crew to build the Beatles' own private studios, complete with a 78-track. For the executive youth, there was a lift, and on the third floor, a well-stocked kitchen and pantry, stocked with everything from bacon buddies to caviar. 2 cordon bleu chefs made dishes all hours of the day, including ham and eggs for Ringo and roast leg of lamb for business lunches. A full-time bouncer footman was hired and dressed in a Tommy Nutter frock coat, and girls would be on the front of the steps any time of the day and in any kind of weather. 4 girls waited, and they were there all the time. The Beatles nicknamed them Apple Scruffs. Later, George would write a song about them. On the good side, Derek believed in the Beatles' good intentions and had great enthusiasm. He had the gift of charm, wit, and imagination. On the negative side, Derek liked to drink and take drugs. He would invite all kinds of characters to his office, inviting them to have a drink. The kitchen was kept busy preparing snacks and lunches. The liquor bill could reach £600 a month. At the beginning, the Beatles took a lot of interest in the business. Paul would arrive at the office bright and early every morning and went over the details of running the company, even down to the toilet paper. His pride and joy was the record division. Audition tapes for Apple Records arrived by tens of thousands. Peter Asher ended up signing James Taylor. The only thing that made him hesitate was his occasional heroin use. And then Paul had high hopes for a Welsh singer who was only 17, her name Mary Hopkins. At this time, the White Album came out. It was Paul's idea to have each album individually numbered. There were 30 songs on the album, and it took them 5 months to record and mix. The critics loved the huge selection and diversity. The diversity came because at this time they were working as individuals, not as the 4 Beatles. The only way things got accomplished was for the person who wrote the song to control things, and the other Beatles would be the backup band. Paul was at the controls most of the time, John second, George third. George got only 4 songs on the album, and Ringo hardly contributed at all. He spent his time in the studio playing cards with Neil and Mal. After Ringo left the studios, Paul would dub in his drum tracks, and when Ringo came in the next day, he would pretend not to notice that he wasn't playing. Fans never found out, but this had to hurt Ringo. And one day, Ringo went home and told Maureen he was no longer a Beatle. He got upset when Paul tried to tell him how to play. He quit. Maureen, of course, got nervous at this news. Ringo, for the next few days, played with his kids or thought about what had happened. And then finally he got bored and was a bit upset that no one tried to get him back. And he announced he was returning to the Beatles. But I'm going to stop the video here. In this episode, we had 2 of the Beatles, John and Paul, changing partners in their relationships. John was totally involved with Yoko, and he and Yoko got into heroin. Paul was upset that Jane wouldn't give up her career and spend all her time with him, so he found others to fill the void. Linda kept persisting in her relationship with Paul, and it worked because she eventually was invited to stay at his house, and she never left. The boutique was a disaster, so the Beatles just let the public come in and take what they wanted. Next, they created a new Apple Corporation and started to sign up acts. The Beatles were also busy at this time creating the White Album. Things weren't the same in the studio, and it seemed like everyone was just doing their own thing, which must have felt weird. In the next video, we'll come to an end on this series by the book by Peter Brown entitled The Love You Make. I love to read all the books on the Beatles, and we get to see this group through the lenses of someone from the outside. It's been an interesting book, and I found out details I hadn't heard about before. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.